This is the Leadership in Insurance podcast, brought to you by FinPro Search Partners.
Insurance companies are businesses and they need to look for the long term and be sustainable.
We went from 0 to 1 and now it's going from 1 to 100.
Insurance as a concept, as a kind of service, is brilliant. The execution is what we're looking at now.
I think the companies that are going to succeed are the ones that are going to understand and master the art of intent.
When we talk about innovation, we lean too heavily to think about technology and we don't think about creating a culture of innovation.
I think innovation is essentially continuous improvement of existing processes and platforms and product.
Right? It's got to be easy. It's got to be seamless.
Good morning and welcome to the Leadership and Insurance podcast. This is the Emerging Tech series and I'm your host, Gavin Savage. Today, I am very lucky to be joined by not one, but two guests. I'm joined by the Chief Architect, Kevin Greene, and CTO, Vivek from Kin Insurance. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us, Gavin.
Yeah, thank you. Before we begin, it's probably, rather than me make a mess of trying to introduce what your roles are at Kin, maybe you want to just quickly explain a little bit about, your journey into Kin, and explain a little bit about what you both do at the business.
Sure.
Kevin, why don't you go first?
Yeah. So I am currently the Chief Architect at Kin, which on paper generally means that I'm heavily involved in figuring out what technology we're using, figuring out how best teams can work on that technology, sometimes building proof of concepts, sometimes helping teams get over humps. But in terms of how I joined Kin and my journey there, I joined when Kin was much, much smaller, about 6 years ago at this point. So while on paper that is what the Chief Architect does, there's also a lot of historical context that I'm pulled in for, or business context I'm pulled in for, as I've seen the business grow quite a bit over my time there.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. I primarily first try to get out of Kevin's way to make sure he can do what he needs to do. I started my journey in the consulting world. I moved to large corporate for about 6-8 years, and then I came back to the startup world after that. I've been at a couple of startups, so I was super excited when Kin came along for various reasons. For me, the big thing, the joy of working in a startup is where tech can be a differentiator, right? If tech cannot be a business differentiator for that business, then it's not particularly interesting for me individually. So, when I started chatting with Sean, who's our CEO, and Lucas was, the previous CTO and co-founder, it was quite apparent to me how much, even though possibly outwardly a stodgy industry like insurance is pretty data-oriented, pretty tech-focused, and where this industry is going is extremely tech-centric than perhaps what you might imagine from the outside.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. And I guess maybe this one's for Kevin, but happy for either of you to tag in. But the evolution, this podcast, the tech series, brings in a new wave of listeners, but by and large, it's insurtech or insurance founders, investors, and really just anyone in the space. But we're now bringing as I say, a new audience in with this series. But I'm pretty sure most people have heard of who Kin Insurance are, but just in case they've not, would one of you mind just describing a little bit about the Kin Insurance business, and I guess the evolution of it since its inception to current scale over the last 7 years?
Yeah. So when Kin started, it really started as an industry choice, not necessarily a specific startup. So the co-founders, Lucas and Sean, they were really oriented at breaking into an industry that had a large market cap. While they had a lot of fintech background, they didn't necessarily have a lot of insurance background. And from there, it was all about figuring out market fit in insurance. So at one point, a very, very early acquisition of Kins was buying an agency that operated in Illinois. We then worked with that agency to get the basics of writing policies. This was early days where I think everyone at Kin had to be a licensed insurance agent just to understand the business really well, including everyone working on the tech side. Over time, we eventually started partnering with a company in Florida acting as an agency, but not one that actually managed anything, not an MGA, just a standard agency in front of them, selling Florida home insurance policies. It was a big market with a lot of players who weren't super comfortable being there, a lot of national brands especially. So it was a good opportunity to sort of get started. From there, we really refined our Florida experience a lot, and eventually realized that in order to really have control over everything, especially after a couple of business relationships either didn't work out, or we had trouble making the partnerships that we wanted, or we had trouble getting the terms that made certain things financially make sense for us. We sort of went all in on building our own carrier. And we launched our own carrier in Florida in 2019, I want to say. And since then, we've been sort of slowly growing with an eye towards states that are underserved by current markets. So typically that tends to be catastrophe-prone states. We have a lot of experience working in hurricane states, and geographically it is trended to be the southeast portion of America, especially coastal states, though that is expanding every month, it feels like.
A really powerful combination, and in the end, when you look at, well, very recently, that value chain, the highest returns and margins is very much on the distribution. So the last 3-4 years for you guys at Kin must have been supercharged, really, from a technology standpoint and from breaking into more and more, I guess, verticals across the US.
Yeah, one of the things that was both stressful but also very rewarding is there's a very different approach to the technology when you're building what amounts to a lead generation engine for an agency, and when you're building technology that needs to deal with statutory reporting requirements on a quarterly basis. Especially that first year that we were a carrier, there were a lot of hard lessons learned where it was like, oh, we have to actually shift the way we're doing development. We have to really up our orientation around quality, because if you mess up a sale, you're out that sale. But if you mess up reporting to one of these regulatory bodies and they come in and they fine you $5,000 per instance and it affects 40% of your business, you're not a company anymore. And that was a really big thing, especially early on, but is still very much so a part of how we develop technology. Is how do we make things right? How do we focus on compliance first while still being able to deliver quickly, while still being able to innovate? And that was the big shift that came with being a carrier.
And the technology behind the whole machine allows you guys to really understand we had Sean on the original series of the podcast, and it was interesting hearing how the tech allows it to really understand those physical properties of not just the buildings that you insure, but how each building reacts differently to these, events that, we're seeing more and more, unfortunately, of in the US. So technology's played a pivotal role in Kin's approach to underwriting, pricing, and serving customers better. Like, for you, Kevin or Vivek, which technologies do you think have been the greatest levers on the business? Because Kin started with a bunch of property data to help price and underwrite accurately. Did that actually pan out to be as impactful as originally thought? And if not, keen to hear about, the evolution as it's went on.
I'll say there are two strategies that Kin and the reason why the tech industry even exists is one is just speed, right? Like, so we're not getting any data that no one has access to. I mean, it's not like we've got some secret investigators giving us data that no one has access to. We have data that almost everyone has access to. But what we do really well is stitch them well together and work and sort of have a business that can react to that data quickly. And you may, I use the example of a gym. Everyone has access to the gym, but not everyone goes to the gym, and not everyone goes to the gym as frequently. Now, given the same resources, the outcome for this group of people will be different because of how they leverage the resources that they have access to. So similarly, I think we've built a company, and I think it's been easier for us to do that as a startup than perhaps you might with a legacy company, which would convince people to behave differently. We've sort of just built a company that acts differently, thinks differently, and the expectation is differently, right? So, if I send a note to Kevin, he is thinking about it and responding to it in minutes. I have, worked with larger companies. That's not how it works. Just is not how it works. You have a culture that values thoughtfulness. Cannot replace a culture of thoughtfulness with tools and technologies. It is just a culture of thoughtfulness where thoughtfulness is recognized and appreciated, and lack of thoughtfulness is immediately, exposed, so to speak. I don't know what's the right word for it. So when you think about, applying technology to this, I think our speed at which we can leverage data and technology to get things done, the expectation management on the culture of how we build things is a big part of why our tech teams are phenomenally successful compared to others in the market. The other thing that is interesting is intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty is a thing where you're kind of fooling yourself into believing facts that don't exist. And you've seen insurance companies in the market fare quite terribly because you're viewing data that is unfavorable in a favorable light and hoping for the best versus recognizing that data is unfavorable, because the actions that you need to take for unfavorable data are not popular. And to take unpopular actions based on not favorable data is hard to do. So intellectual curiosity is a big part, I think, of how we succeed as tech. You may not think of it that way. You're like, wow, you've given me an answer that has nothing to do with tech, making a tech team successful. But I will say that to me, that is why we are successful. And I've seen a lot of different organizations, and Kevin has seen a lot of organizations as well. So this is mostly a thing about how do different tech teams behave and what is their DNA.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I think expanding on that, a lot of the things that are built into the culture of a fast and efficient tech company end up also becoming really impactful technology choices that we use. So, for example, Vivek talked about the fact that we use a lot of data sources that are readily available. A lot of times you might be signing up for a long contract, or you might be entrenched with a particular vendor, but we don't use any data set that a different insurance company couldn't also contract with. Mm-hmm. However, we have things set up in a way that if we need to suddenly change vendors, either because the contract changes or because our data analysis suggests that, hey, well, this is great for roof condition in Florida, it's not actually the best thing for roof condition in South Carolina. There's a gap in the company, and we need to switch things. We've built things in a way that kind of a change of switching between things we already have can be a very long decision-making process where we're doing our due diligence with the data. But when it comes time to actually implement it, everything is highly configurable. So that change only takes 10 minutes. Or when we need to launch a totally new data source, everything is templatized and productized to a point where, rather than thinking about the things that we build as custom proprietary tech, the things that we build are tools for folks really heavily in the insurance world, really heavily in the analytics world, to make decisions and then just sort of plug and play what they need.
That's a really good point. And I'll maybe throw another aspect of our organization that allows us to build this tech, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about culture. We put a lot of emphasis in our people and hiring and the expectations for different types of engineers in the organization that lead to the outcomes that Kevin is talking about. Because, our engineers don't want to create stuff that is essentially not built in a way that is not configurable, expandable. It's not to say we don't have challenges. We have lots of tech challenges as well, but I think we have better chance of unwinding those things because of the motivations of our engineering teams and product teams. Just to be, we often talk only about engineering standalone. Our product teams are phenomenal partners that are not antagonistic towards solving the systemic issue, and that's a big thing.
The kind of, again, to mention, I would say love triangle, but we could expand that, between everything that you've mentioned there, and as your role as a CTO, Kevin's is the architect, and you have engineering and product. I often think my experience of, unfortunately for now, podcasting is not the day-to-day job, it's executive search. So that, speaking to architects and CTOs on the market, it seems like, when maybe architects are looking to move on, or if I'm asking them about, their day-to-day, they're always looking for, they're always looking for, they're looking at the technology strategy, they're they're solving problems. It's designed through solving the most complex pieces long term. And then I guess my question is based around architecture, non-functional requirements, and then you have product managers that are constantly pushing for new features. In a company like Kin, where you guys are constantly, pushing the boundaries, and that along comes with new features and new ideas and new product. How do you address the balance of this with, non-functional requirements, technical debt? Where are the kind of the trade-offs there for you guys as a CTO and architect that are really overseeing all of that?
Yeah, I love this question because this is something that's near and dear to my heart. Because I'm a big believer that if you cannot convey the reason to product why you should do a thing, you maybe shouldn't do that thing. So what I mean by that is I've heard a lot of technologists over the years describe things with big concerning terms. Sometimes it is technical debt. Sometimes it is a framework is getting outdated. Sometimes it is just a desire to use some sort of new data store or new feature. And none of those things is bad necessarily, but none of those things is necessarily good. If you can't convey to someone, hey, we should embrace this technology because while I think it might slow down the next 2 months of development, we might launch the next state or two slower. over the course of the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years, it'll make us much, much faster. So the answer that I have, or the direction that I really heavily try to push any engineers at Kin towards, is think from their perspective. Your goal isn't to say, hey, this is a good thing, we need to do it. Your goal should be to explain why this is a good thing, why we need to do it. Yeah, and in my experience, especially if you're doing that consistently and honestly, product will respect that. Because if you talk to any person in product or any person on the business side of the house, as long as they're not incredibly short-term focused, like they're trying to hit some goal in the next 2 weeks or the next month, if you're trying to convey to them how it'll help us meet the year's goals or the 3-year plan goals, they'll be receptive and they'll trust you.
I ask our teams to think of themselves as the general manager of the business rather than, engineer or product. Like, you're the general manager of the business. You tell me what's the right thing to do, because auto companies have to deal with this a lot more than us. If you build, crappy engines and the car has a phenomenal paint job, you're not going to succeed as a company. I mean, maybe you'll succeed for the first 2 years, but as your brand, goes to the mud and your automobiles are then shunned by everyone in the industry and your customers, you will not be successful. So, if you think about it as a general manager of the business, you're going to, start to make decisions that are good for the short term and the long term health of the business. You cannot make only short-term decisions and you cannot make only long-term decisions. Any business that does only short, only long is going to not be a long-term business. You have to make trade-offs all the time. And I will say that teams that have psychological safety will do the right thing. The teams that don't have psychological safety will tend to do the wrong thing. Because if you're under some fear, unsaid, unspoken fear of, doing the right thing because of the wrong reasons, you will say, what, it's like what the politicians do, right? It's like, what, I'm here for 2 years, I'm going to just do what makes sense for the 2 years. Who cares about what happens 20 years? That's, going off track a little bit. What happens in our political system, we just continue to make short-term decisions. But that's not how most good, well-functioning teams work. They will make short-term and long-term decisions, and advocacy is important. So I think Kevin has a lot more experience and has a lot more perspective on what could go wrong. So you can imagine a boat leaving from New York that is 6 degrees off. Now, an uninformed captain may say, well, it's only 6 degrees off, it'll be fine. But you might reach the Horn of Africa instead of the UK if you just continue down that path. An experienced leader will see where those 6 degrees are going to land you and will either stop you right away and say, no, you can't go 6 degrees off, you got to adjust course now, or they'll let you go 6 degrees off for some period of time and then adjust course. But you can't be a successful leader if you simply accept that your ship is going to be 6 degrees off and just continue down that path for the entire Atlantic or Pacific journey. You're not going to land in the right place. So you have to exercise your judgment, and I think judgment is worth a lot. I mean, we pay people to have good judgment because they will not make the wrong decision for the business, and you can't live in this world where you make poor decisions and just continue going. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen that in our business. I'll give you a good example. We were trying to do something to improve our productivity, and we didn't have data on that productivity. So we started measuring the loss of productivity because the subsystem was failing. And we found that that subsystem was causing a lot of pain, but we didn't have that captured as a metric. As soon as you captured that as a metric, we're like, oh my God, that's how much pain it's causing. And then we introduced other software development metrics. We bought the system that showed us the impact of that. It took us 3 days to solve the actual problem, which was not solved for years. It had gone on for years because we just didn't know how much pain it was causing. It was 3 days to solve the problem. And then we saw almost a 40% improvement in productivity. I mean, I would say that anyone that can accomplish that would do it, but they don't because they don't know. So one big aspect of running good engineering teams is to have data, like just know, because once you know, it becomes so much easier. No one fights you because they're like, oh my God, it's crazy. So we saw our lead times go down. Kevin, keep me honest here. I think our lead times went from 22 or 25 days to 12 days of change lead time. It's like 50% cut in change lead times. I mean, that is, if I could not have asked for a better outcome if I, ramped it up. It's really good.
Amazing. And you mentioned something, I mean, I'm really passionate about it, particularly within, of course, we're on the tech series, but, within engineering and specifically, you mentioned psychological safety throughout that description there. And, that's about how big is the engineering team at Kin presently?
The product engineering team is about 140, the total
140.
product engineering teams.
And so, and you clearly value each and every, and it's the way it should be, but, each and every engineering product professional at the business. And you clearly speak about them like they are entrepreneurs and they are partners within the business. It's not just about execution. And that really comes back to psychological safety, because I think in a lot of, particularly in companies I've noticed within insurance or financial services, that, you have the business, the wider business, different functions, and then you have engineering, which is over here, and they're kind of in this black box to a degree, and no one quite knows what they're doing, but they know they're doing some pretty cool stuff. It's like black magic. But that psychological safety, I think what I'm getting at, one is the kind of culture piece, which we can, unpack later. But as you scale from, as Kevin's been a founding member, and you scale to 140-ish, how do you maintain that psychological safety? Kevin mentioned about explaining to everyone about, we're going to do this and this is why we're going to do it. But I think a lot of businesses, and I certainly from my interactions with other CTOs and founders, that becomes more difficult as you scale. But you guys still seem to have that really close-knit coordination and communication between everyone. Like, how do you protect that psychological safety? And I guess what does that mean to you, that word or that phrase?
So to me, when I hear psychological safety, the number one thing I want to protect in terms of engineers I work with is I want them to feel comfortable taking a risk on a thing that they think is a good idea, but aren't 100% sure will succeed. There are a lot of ideas that are successful 80% of the time, but are going to have a much, much bigger impact if you do all of those and then unwind the ones that fail than if you only try to do ideas that are successful 100% of the time. So in terms of how we can kind of protect that and how we can kind of help that, there are a couple options. A big thing is, while my title is architect, I work a little bit differently than other places I've been with people who have that same title. I've seen other places where the architect's job is to design the entirety of the system and then say to a staff engineer, here, build me this, please. And that, when I was in those sorts of staff engineer roles, was a very unsatisfying relationship. So instead, a lot of the architecture at Kin really tries to be driven by employees as much as possible. So that could be through weekly office hours that we have. That could be through a weekly meeting where we get all of the staff engineers across Kin together to chat about ideas that they might have or opportunities that they might see. It could be through things like subgroups that we've started doing that are a little bit comparable to guilds that we've seen other places. So, for example, following like Spotify's guild mentality, but a little bit more restricted to really try and empower those folks to make a change. Hey, we really want to do something different with how we're approaching API developments. We've seen a lot of different practices put into place, and we want to have a group that decides on some standards. Let's get a group of 6 people together, and their goal for Q4 is come up with good standards. And those are going to involve talking to a lot of people. Those are going to involve building useful tools for other people to use. So ultimately, all that is to say is when I hear psychological safety, I hear being able to take risks comfortably. And in terms of what's helped me throughout my career, being able to take risks comfortably, it's been knowing that someone has my back if I fail, and knowing that the idea does have merit just by bouncing it off of a couple other folks. So building a structure where people feel supported and people feel like they have outlets to express those ideas and gain support for those ideas is what I think we really try to do, at least on my end when I hear psychological safety.
Gavin, you mentioned something that I think is also a really important aspect of why some tech companies succeed and some don't. You mentioned like having IT over here versus IT embedded in the business.
Yeah.
There's a guy called Marty Kagan that wrote this really great blog article, I think a decade or so ago, about companies that have an IT mindset versus a product mindset. And companies that create an IT mindset, and it's a really fantastic article, you should read it, are companies that look at technology as a services business and simply look at those tech teams saying, do this, and that's all they do. They become a ticketing engine. They're like, I'm going to create tickets, use all those tickets, become ticketing engine. The tech teams in those companies are not vested in the success of their business. They don't quite see themselves as being part of the success of the business. They simply see themselves as, ticket machines and looking at ticketing. And once you have that IT mindset and a product mindset, then you start making decisions based, and the products of these companies look very different. A product built by product companies, the product companies thinking of users, thinking of success, thinking of KPIs, thinking of, how I'm going to streamline that user experience and make sure that the user is successful, that this business is successful, that we're providing or solving the needs of the user. And IT mindset company products will look very different because they're simply solving exactly what they're told for. They're not using any creativity. They're not really thinking about the problem. They're simply thinking about efficiency and ticketing. And while efficiency is certainly important to every organization, an organization that doesn't have a product mindset is going to be a very different organization. And when you have teams that are out here, then you have teams that have data science models that take years to go to production. They have data scientists, you have 200 data scientists, and they cannot launch a data science model to production. They just cannot. And it puts a lot of friction in the process because, combination of not having psychological safety means that I can't experiment easily. I can't make a mistake. And so I'm going to make sure everything is, 110% correct before it goes to the next stage. The person on the next stage is making sure that they have CY in place so that, they don't receive something that they're going to put forward. And so this organization is beset by CY mentality and is beset by people making sure that they're doing the minimum to get fired, and they are responding to tickets and all of the stuff. You can't just look at it. You look at it and you're like, what is going on? Why can't we produce anything? Because it's unsaid expectations. You can't have, the people won't say it. When they don't have this in place, they won't just speak up, they won't say it. And the organization is slow. It creates poor products. It has more losses. It has more, LAE. And you're looking at it from a Six Sigma lens, and then you're looking at cycle times, and you're looking at all kinds of stuff because people are just not willing to work in that process, and it just destroys these companies.
Hmm. Do you think, and this by no means sounds like it's the case, it can, but insurance is so risk averse, and then you couple an insurance business with insurance experts with technology people, and then you're asking, you're working with potentially a company as an engineer in an industry that thinks in decades, in terms of the product that they're offering. So do you think it's more difficult if you're an engineer that doesn't come from a previous insurtech or highly regulated industry, because you're having to then learn insurance, learn why you're building the thing, learn the challenges with it, and the whole business model is about being risk averse, but then you're asking engineers to take risks and put themselves out there. But do you think that the insurance industry has a way of maybe stifling, or I don't know, maybe it's not a fair question because it's not the case.
No, I think it's. I think it is. I think it goes back to, if you have a tech team that doesn't understand the business, then they're going to behave in an uninformed way, right? Because
Yeah.
they just understand the business, or they're not vested in the business itself. They're just gonna, well, you told me to do it, I'm going to do it. So when we talk about taking risks, we're not taking any risk that would, create a situation where we're not in compliance, or whether,
Yeah.
we have regulatory risk. We don't take risks in that fashion, but we may take risks in perhaps the user experience that we see, and we'll say, well, we think this experience versus that experience. Well, let's try it out. Let's see, what the customer responds to better. It's in a lot of different aspects. We may think that our, pricing model is approved and within range, but we want to understand how the customer reacts to those. So I think we will always work within the regulatory framework, because that's in no one's interest, not the customers, nor the regulators, nor Keen's interest to not be within that bound. But there are a lot of things we can do to understand how to make a customer's experience better. And we do that. When we get claims calls, we're constantly trying to figure out during hurricane season how to shorten the amount of time that we take to solve a customer's problem. So we're taking, a lot of experimentation in that process to understand how to respond faster, how to respond better to customers' calls, switching different things around. And that is just about improving the customer experience. So experimentation does not always, or doesn't need to be at odds with regulation.
Or the expense of the business or the reputation.
Yeah.
I guess based on everything that I'm hearing from you both, maybe the answer to this is no different. But I was interested to ask it hypothetically, if Kin was founded today, how would the tech strategy, or how would the technical strategy, be different? Do you think it would be different because it's so baked into the culture that it seems like you wouldn't change a thing and it would be the same as it was 7 years ago?
In terms of broad culture, I think we would definitely try to maintain a lot of the same mentality that we're talking about. I can, as any developer I can point to specific things that I wrote 5 years ago that I'm like, I don't know that that's the right way to do it. But from a broad strategy, I definitely say that figuring out a way where we can have people in tune with the business needs, especially, and people in tune with what are appropriate risks to take, and in tune with product as well, would definitely be high on the list. In terms of things that might be a little bit different if I was a part of starting Kin over right now. Our original stack for everything, top to bottom, was Ruby on Rails, which we chose primarily because we were a Chicago-based startup company. Chicago is the birthplace of Rails and has a ton of different pedigree in Chicago startups. You have folks like Groupon here, who are all Rails, and a lot of others. And especially early on, a lot of folks came from Groupon and Amount, which at the time was called Avant. And all that to say is Rails has been great for us. It's been a super effective tool for us to quickly deploy business-oriented solutions. But if I were starting today, certainly as we've grown, hiring your first 5 developers in Chicago is a very different story than hiring your next 100 developers from all over. It's got a little bit less of a mind share and a little bit less of a up and coming skill set, just based on applicants that we've been talking to. There are a lot of folks who love it. I love it a lot myself. But it certainly, hiring has been a little bit more difficult than it was 7 years ago. So that might, just core tech choices might be a thing that I adjusted.
It's really interesting. Yeah, and as you've evolved in Chicago, everyone was in the office probably years ago. How has that evolved now? Is everyone distributed across the US? Is the tech team fully remote, or is it a little bit of everything?
I would hesitate to say anything other than that we're fully remote.
Okay.
What I mean by that is I tend to consider us a little bit of a hybrid, because I'll go into the office once or twice a month to catch up with people. But in my experience, when people say they're hybrid, they mean we work in the office 3 days a week. The company's trying to pressure us to go more and more. Whereas for us, we have folks in, I don't have an actual number of states off the top of my head, but I would guess at least 20 different states that I work with day to day. And right before COVID hit, we actually already were at a point where we were building up a Florida office. So it came at a time for us where we had within the past year or two gone through what does it look like to have employees in other states? And then had already sort of bitten off that initial bullet. And then I think it was a couple of months into COVID where someone said, well, I don't know that we're ever actually going to go back. And some folks started moving to other states, and we had a referral who was a great hire in a new state that we were in. So I would say we're very much so fully distributed, fully remote, though we do try to get together either at a team level or at a leadership level in Chicago with some regularity.
Interesting. And I'm conscious of your guys' time, so I'll wrap this up. I have a few more questions, so I'll pick one of them that I had left. But going back to the kind of the strategy and the toolkit that you mentioned, maybe there's a few things that you tweak, i.e. the Ruby on Rails language. Like, looking forward, where we couldn't get through an episode without mentioning AI, of course. But where does AI fit into the strategy? Is that something that you can discuss now, or is it like, just kind of keen to see how that fits into the Kin puzzle at this point?
Yeah, I think we can discuss it. So AI, I always find really interesting when it comes to insurance, because when you hear about the sort of catchiest things in sort of popular mindset right now, you have a lot of things like ChatGPT, and you have a lot of people who are automating communications with customers or automating responses to questions. But in insurance, you sort of can't have a false positive or false negative. Like if someone asks about their coverage and you tell them the wrong thing, it kind of becomes the right thing. Because if you told someone they were covered, then they're covered. And if they sue you, they're probably going to win a lawsuit against you. So where we've had a lot of exploration and a lot of success isn't the sort of first thought, ChatGPT is amazing, let's use it everywhere, because we want to make sure that a customer is, one, always talking to someone who will be accurate more than anything. We have had a lot of success trying to explore AI as ways to either help internal employees, where someone asks, well, hey, what does roof surface payment schedule mean in my coverage? We might not necessarily be comfortable showing an outside customer whatever an AI tool has to say, but we might be more comfortable surfacing, hey, this is what we think it is. As always, double check. Here's a link to something, to an internal agent.
Right.
And we've had a lot of success when it comes to analyzing different ways to improve loss ratio with AI. So either trying to figure out, hey, what's the most likely group to be hit with a hurricane? How can we send them texts in advance? What are our learning models telling us about expected loss ratios for homes? How can we use that information when it comes to whether or not we want to buy a lead from an automated lead source? That sort of thing. Vivek might have other examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't have a definitive view of what AI is, as Kevin alluded to earlier, which creates a wide variance of what the expectation is. I think traditional machine learning, we use it extensively, right?
Yeah.
Machine learning is a subset of AI, but traditional machine learning, we use it quite extensively to understand pricing, underwriting, images, and so on and so forth. What we call, what the example we use today with ChatGPT is slightly different, that tries to mimic human cognitiveness. And I will say that the uses of things that require human cognitiveness in the insurance industry are more limited. As Kevin said, we can't give vague answers to people's questions. You have to really make sure they're accurate. So I think I would say that part of it is probably an area where we're learning, trying to make sure that we understand the use and apply it where it is, maybe applicable. But we use machine learning quite extensively in the space, and so do a lot of other companies. I think we just do it better. Maybe I might have bias be on that, but I think we do it quite well. And also, as I talked about the speed, having a deep understanding of your data, being able to model that data, being able to apply that data to business cases, that cycle time, that closed loop is really important for a company to be successful. If you don't have a closed loop and that loop is not fast, then your value is going to be lower than otherwise. So I think we do a good job of that. But I think to your question of whether we're using cognitive AI as much, I will say I think we still have to find a killer use case for cognitive AI.
No, thank you. That's super interesting. And yeah, I think you're right. I think you're definitely right. Everyone's, specifically within insurance anyway, still trying to figure out and define where it can go and what value it can add. Seems like everyone's constantly looking over their shoulder to see who's doing what with it. But yeah, just an interesting kind of last question I wanted to get your opinion on. So, guys, thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting and such a pleasure to have you on. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Kevin. Cheers.